Okay, I hope you folks can see me now. Let's double check this here. Without my producer, it's sometimes a little weird. All right, let's see what we got. Oh man. Yep, looks like we're okay. All right. A while, but we're up and running. So here's the so Susanna, since you were asking, this is my shirt. One of my many Halloween shirts. All right, no costume for me. All right, sorry for the delay on this, everybody. I'm not sure what happened with I had to actually open on the window and relaunch the site, the channel to actually connect, and it connected right away. So that's very, very weird. Happy Halloween, and welcome to another episode of Ask Professor Paranormal. I think I said last time, 2 weeks ago, that I was going to do something a little different tonight. I still will answer a couple of questions because I do have a couple of questions, but I'm going to talk about some cases, some ghost stories. Tell you a couple from some other people have told me, and I thought I'd talk about a couple of my interesting cases. But before I do that, I was reminded by my friend Dave Manganelli that I did not, I was remiss in mentioning a movie that he thinks is the best ghost movie ever, and it's a really good ghost movie. Last time I talked about a bunch of good movies. One of them is called The Innocents, which has been rated as kind of a top really good spooky ghost movie. So if you haven't seen that, it was a 1961 film. It is actually based on Henry James' story, The Screw. And there have been other adaptations of it for movie and TV, and they're all called The Turn of the Screw, but The Innocents is the best version of that. For those of you who may not know the story, it's a really interesting ghost story. It was written by this gentleman, Henry James, whose brother, William James, was one of the early psychical researchers. He was president of the ASPR, the American Society for Psychical Research, at one point. He was heavily involved in the Society for Psychical Research. So I found it, it's really interesting that Henry James was kind of using some of that same stuff that William James was using, but for fiction. Just keeping it in the family, I guess. William James is also kind of considered the father of American psychology in many respects. So anyway, there's that. And if we want to talk about some other movies, we can definitely do that. I didn't mention some other movies that I really enjoyed last time. We'll talk about them at some other point. So the other was a question. Let's see if I got this question here. And the question is interesting. Tina is not with us tonight. She's one of our regulars. Why are hauntings scary, but mediumship readings heartfelt and engaging? That's actually a pretty simple answer. Most people don't intentionally go to haunt, unless you're a ghost hunter, don't intentionally go to haunting to have an experience in spirit communication. Again, unless you're really interested in that. And even then, people who do that because there's no one in control of the situation except perhaps the people on the other side, and there's no personal connection in that haunting, then it can be kind of creepy, scary, or just simply really odd. With mediumship, people are intentionally going for spirit communication with the hopes of communicating with someone they know who has passed away. There still are people who get scared by that when it actually happens. They're curious sometimes, and I've seen people at various mediumship readings, with whether they're gallery readings, large group meetings, or smaller groups, and also at the Forever Family Foundation events, including our grief transformation retreats, where there are some people that kind of either freak out a little bit about the fact that the medium actually is getting good information, evidential stuff, or in some instances, they're not getting to talk. They get a little upset because they're not talking to the person that they want to talk to. So mediumship can be a little bit weird. So I'm having underwater audio. I wonder, man, thank you for letting me know that. I don't know. Let's see. See if we can edit the settings. I'm not sure if I can do that. Yeah, I think I'm kinda stuck unless I sign off. I don't know that there's a way to actually change the obviously, it's hooked into the wrong microphone on my computer. That's what it looks like. Yeah, it's hooked into the wrong one. Um, Let me see if I can change this in settings. It does not look like it. They don't really give you an opportunity at this point. It's only in the actual original schedule setup. Maybe we can do something here. Nope. Okay. Hopefully it's coming through well enough for everybody. And my voice is not very strong. I've got a little post-nasal drip that's kind of killing my voice a little bit. Um, anyway, I one of the when we're just talking about those, what I was just talking about for the mediumship stuff, people go to see mediums because they do want to connect with a loved one. They want to connect with a good friend, maybe a parent, child, something like that. So that's not where you go. You're in a haunting for. However, I will say that people freak out and do get freaked out, scared when someone in the family may have died and they appear to you after they have died or at the moment of death. Not everybody takes that in stride. Some people are freaked out by it. And in fact, I can tell you a quick story about this. There was a woman who called us at, and I may have mentioned, I'm pretty sure I've talked about this particular instance on some various past episodes, but back in the 1980s, when I was working in New York at the American Society for Psychical Research, I was doing a number of episodes as a guest of a show called The Edge of Reality with Elliot Lee Spiegel at WNBC Radio. It was a late night show on Sunday nights covering the unexplained, and it was on AM radio. So it was a pretty cool thing to be there at NBC. And I had grown up going into NBC with my dad quite a bit. So at one point, we were taking callers, and a woman called up and said that her son had died. Her son had moved away from Boston. He was in his 20s. He'd moved away to Boston, from New York to Boston, not too long before, like maybe a month or so before. And shortly after he moved up there, he moved for a job. He was killed in a car accident. And ever since he died, she said, she was hearing his voice, and his voice was saying, "Mom, I have to tell you something. Mom, I have to tell you something." And she said, being a good devout Catholic, thought this was very bad. So she didn't respond at all. She was asking what to do. What do I do about that? And I said, "Have you talked to your priest?" She said, "No." I said, "Talk to your priest. He will probably tell you exactly what I'm about to tell you." Ask him what he wants. So she did. We had her call back. We asked her to call back because I was going to be on a couple weeks later. We asked her to call back, say what the priest said and what happened. She did call back. She said, "The priest did say exactly what you told me." So I said, "Yes, what do you want?" And she said, what she heard was, "It's about time, Mom." She said that it was just like her son. "I just want to tell you that my new job had a life insurance policy on me, and you're the beneficiary. And it's so quick after I died, and you didn't even get the information about the company, and they didn't track you down yet. But here's the information about the policy." Well, it turned out to be a $250,000 life insurance policy. She contacted the company based on the information he gave her through this message. Once he delivered the message, he said, "Thanks for listening. Uh, Love you. Bye bye." It was like a phone call. And she didn't hear from him again. So, again, it was a $250,000 life insurance policy. Nobody ever gives us money in parapsychology. The money actually, she did give 10% to the church at that point, which was fine. But that's the kind of thing that can happen. She was freaked out because of her religious beliefs, even though a lot of Catholics don't believe that, especially the priesthood doesn't necessarily believe that's a bad thing, what she experienced. Some do, but it was a real positive outcome for her, of course. All right. Mary Prankster, do you think there are times of the year when the veil of the afterlife is thinner? You know, that's of course what we hear about this time of year. The Halloween, All Hallows Eve is the night before All Saints Day, and All Saints Day is the time when the veil is thinner. It's also the Day of the Dead. Um, so it culturally there are people who believe that, but there doesn't really seem to be that kind of regular incident or incidents of that kind of communication. Mediums are capable of communicating as long as people are willing to talk to them any time of year. It really doesn't matter. But one thing that could potentially affect them and does seemingly affect psychic abilities in general is the geomagnetic field. So the Earth's magnetic field can support as it rises and falls in local areas, can allow for certain abilities or certain expressions of ESP and psychokinesis to come through much more easily or stronger, or seemingly cut them down a little bit. Doesn't seem to affect mediums though. That's interesting. Kathy Nadal is here, one of our Forever Family Foundation mediums. Hello. All right, let me tell you another quick little ghost story since I answered that one question. But I am watching, so if there are questions, feel free to ask. So I thought I'd tell you first a couple of stories that have been told to me that are pretty interesting. Some pretty credible people. So I back in the 80s again, 1980s was interesting for television here locally and nationally. You know, there were this is before even cable got really started. We were just at the start of it, and certainly before streaming. There were a lot of daytime talk shows that were local. We had three here in the Bay Area, a couple of morning shows, besides things like the national shows like the Today Show. We had a couple of morning shows. We had an afternoon show. Um, more and more shows were just, they were all over the place. And then there were the magazine shows like Hard Copy and Evening Magazine and all of those that would do pieces, especially around this time of year. It was very, very common at this time of year. So I was on a local show. It was our CBS affiliate, KPIX. And the host, Patrick Van Horn, who went on to CBS as a national newscaster type, was hosting the show and interviewing myself. He also had on the show that day uh, the manager of the Winchester Mystery House, as well as Antoinette May, who wrote a book on haunted houses in California, including talking about the Winchester Mystery House. So, just as a quick step aside, I did talk to, for any of you who have been to Northern California, and if you have not been to the Winchester Mystery House, but because it's a really cool place to see. And there are a lot of stories about it. And what the manager told me is that they encourage the docents to make stories up because it made it more fun for people. So most of the stories are untrue, even though there is one ghost there. It's not as many in or the way it's talked about. So then I was interviewed. I think it was right after my book ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists came out, and Patrick was very skeptical throughout the entire show. At the end, we're off camera. We start walking away from the seating, and he said, I have to tell you that I really do believe in ghosts. And partly that's because I grew up in a haunted farmhouse. So not his entire life, but he was living in the Midwest. His family had bought this farmhouse, converted farmhouse. And when they moved in, it was two-story. They go to bed at night, and usually around 11 o'clock, sometimes a little bit after, they'd start hearing footsteps pacing back and forth in the upstairs hallway outside the bedroom. And they would look outside, look out the room, and they turn on the lights, and the footsteps would stop, or they might continue for a little while, but there's nobody there. And this was going on almost every night. So for those of you who are familiar with the terminology, that would normally be considered a residual haunting, pattern effect left by somebody who's alive. So he said then one time when I was 16, I kind of got fed up. I wanted to know, where did the footsteps come from? Where did they go when they left the room, when they left that part of the house? And he said that he waited. The lights were left on in the hallway. Didn't matter if the lights were on or off. They heard the footsteps. He waited till he heard the footsteps outside his doorway and past his door, went past his door. He steps out into the hallway. He hears the footsteps off a little bit in front of him. He starts walking after the footsteps. And he said for the very first time, the footsteps changed. They started going faster. So Patrick follows after the footsteps a little faster. And the footsteps are heading towards the stairs going downstairs. So Patrick is walking faster. The footsteps are going faster. They hit the stairs. They start running down the stairs. He hears. He starts going down the stairs. He hears the footsteps running off the stairs into the living room. Now, they had hardwood floors with rugs. As he's coming off the stairs himself, he hears from the living room the footsteps, a scuffling sound, and a thud, like somebody had fallen down. He looks in the living room. There's a little tiny bunch up on the rug, whether the ghost did it or not, doesn't matter. But Patrick then starts laughing, and then he heard the footsteps. He said, "I heard the sound of somebody getting up and brushing himself off. I heard the footsteps running for the front door. It didn't open, but the footsteps ran for the front door, and we never heard the ghostly footsteps again." So the lesson here is if you ever want to get a ghost out of your house, one of the best ways is to embarrass him out of the house. Chase the ghost. Don't let the ghost chase you. Okay. Um, Question from Kathy. What's your favorite horror movie this time of year? I'm not really normally big on horror films. I like suspense films, certainly. I would say that what I might watch. I do watch like I love the old Universal horror films. The monster movies, and I'm looking forward to seeing Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein. In fact, um, as far as horror movies, probably the closest ghost movie with a tinge of horror to it, not truly horror, would be The Haunting, a 1963 film that was directed by Robert Wise, one of the best ghost movies out there. And I might watch The Legend of Hell House. It's another one of my favorites, although I have to say that if it's just a horror film and not a ghost movie, The Night Stalker, the original Night Stalker with Darren McGavin playing Kolchak. That I've got the entire Kolchak The Night Stalker series on DVD, so that's probably something I'll be watching here and there for Halloween. Um, so, yeah, that's the best answer. I'm not really much on horror films otherwise. Although there'll be some movies coming up like the Frankenstein movie and Clayface next year when that comes out is supposed to turn a Batman villain movie into a horror film. So that'll be pretty interesting to see. Okay, you said the Queen Mary was quite haunted. You don't think the management plays up that angle to bring in revenue? Of course, they play it up. I mean, they, you know, they do play it. They have. I don't know if the current management does, but they have in the past. And as I've mentioned, certainly my students in classes, and I may have mentioned in this particular podcast, they I don't know if they're still operating, but they had special effects in a number of places, including the pool area, the keel. The battleship uh, were hit, fell overboard and died. They were doing the special effects mainly on their ghost tours that they ran. This is going back to the late '80s and early '90s. I went on one of the ghost tours in the early '90s. Didn't even know that. They never mentioned the special effects, but it was pretty clear there were special effects there, based on the way things were done. And in fact, even in one of the areas, a guy mysteriously stepped out of nowhere and told the story of what had happened there, and then you hear screaming and all sorts of stuff. Um, I never saw anything about the special effects, so even though the Queen Mary does have real phenomena, and they were using the effects for the ghost tours and for other things to replicate it, it kind of bugged me when so many of the ghost shows, the ghost hunter shows, would go there, including during the time that they definitely had the effects. Never once mentioned the effects, but when they covered the Moss Beach Distillery restaurant, which I've worked with for years and years, I think because nothing happened, because the ghost wasn't willing to do anything that day for them. That's all they focused on, claiming they didn't know anything about them, even though if you ran a Google search that day, the day they aired, 8 out of 10 of the top Google results talked about the effects. Now, places do play up. There's no question. Historical places play up the haunting piece for a lot of reasons, one of which is to bring customers in, to bring people there. I mean, it's just like right now, there's how many ghost tours going on in how many towns and cities around the world, around the country, that don't normally run throughout the year. This is the time of year that those things are happening. Disney plays up haunted stuff, even though it's fictional. So, uh, bringing in revenue, a restaurant, and my advice has always been to haunted restaurants. I even teach my students to talk about this. If you're going to approach a restaurant or a business, is the owner of the business is going to ask, does a ghost story, real or not, does that help their business? Does it bring in customers and so on? Does it bring in repeat customers? For a restaurant, they want repeat customers. Oh, they might want tourists too, of course. So when the owner of the Moss Beach Distillery, when I was suggesting that I bring in Japanese TV back in 1991, and a medium to if they wanted to do a segment about a haunted place in the Bay Area. He asked me flat out, "Is this gonna be good for business or bad for business?" And I said to him, "How's your food?" And he said, "It's great, stellar," is what he said. We got a great chef, and the food there at the Mouthpiece is great. And he said, "Why do you ask that?" I said, "Because people might come for the ghost, but if they don't have an experience, they're not gonna come back unless the food is good." If the food is good and for the distillery, they're right on the coast, they have a beautiful view, so it's a beautiful place. They get repeat customers out of that, and that's absolutely true for any haunted restaurant. If your food's good, anybody who knows a haunted restaurant and their food sucks, tell them to get their food better and look at more customers. That's one of my own things on my checklist when I think, do I wanna go in there more than once? It depends on how good the food is, or at least how good the other piece. Okay. I see Tucker and Dale versus Evil, that's really good. Okay, if you wanna go in that direction, Army of Darkness is one of my favorite all-time, no question. I love the Evil Dead movies, at least the old ones with Bruce Campbell, but Army of Darkness is right up there, one of my top movies that I love, and I've seen it many, many times. And for those of you who like Bruce Campbell, there is a movie that you can find on some of the streaming services called My Name is Bruce, in which this town that has been hit by a demonic Chinese ghost that was locked up in a mine, and somebody unfortunately got rid of accidentally knocked out the sigil that kept it there, started going after people, and they decided they were gonna get Bruce Campbell to come and take care of the ghost because they thought Bruce Campbell really fought monsters. So it's a very funny movie of Bruce Campbell being a very different version of Bruce Campbell that you've ever seen. So more laid back. I think he's going on a gig is what he's doing. Okay. Okay, the audio is yeah, I don't know what's going on with the audio there. I tried connecting it to my regular microphone, and it just apparently didn't like that. So our ghosts, the people who haven't crossed so-called crossed over. Um, all right, so when you use the word ghost, it really depends. There's a pop culture, there's cultural stuff. I think most people in Western culture tend to think of a ghost as somebody, not their energy. Um, but others might use that term also for what we would call haunting or residual haunting, where people leave an impression, information. We don't leave energy behind, we leave information in the environment in some way. And that has nothing to do with death. Residual hauntings happen from us living people. And then if we happen to die, that residual haunting can continue after death, just like any old Boris Karloff movie can be watched. He made them all when he was alive, but he's dead now. Um, so we can still watch him. So we leave an impression behind. Some people would see a figure and call that a ghost, but from our perspective in parapsychology, there has to be interactivity to even consider consciousness is happening. Otherwise, it's just a recording in that respect. Now, a lot of not all mediums, but I've talked to many mediums and other psychics who feel that apparition or ghost who's there after they die, people have not crossed over. Most of the situations we end up with apparitions, these are people who are still here in the physical world. They have not crossed over to whatever is next for them, which is why you hear about some psychics helping people to cross over or to move on. And there are ways to do that. The folks I've worked with, and what I personally believe is that there's probably a reason why they're here. We might need to help them understand why that is, whether they think they're stuck, they're not actually stuck, or how to let go so that they do move on. But I've met people who we've had arguments with because they insist on pretty much forcing people into light, forcing ghosts into the light. And that's not appropriate because there may be a karmic reason why they're still here for that matter. Okay. Does the Banta Inn have good food? I haven't been there in the last couple of years. I'm hoping it still does, but it definitely had good food, good steaks, and really good food for a long time. Back in the '80s and '90s, and last time I was there, I'm trying to remember, it was probably out right before the pandemic, I think. Yeah, food was good. Um, and I would say that they got a lot. I mean, they have a lot of regular customers, so I think that's a really important thing. Most of those customers do not come for the ghost; they come for the food. So that's something really important to remember. If any of you wanna work with a haunted restaurant, get to know their business first. You can I've actually given a couple of places, and who've called me, um, over the years, seeing that I've worked with some haunted restaurants, what they should do about because they say they have a real ghost story, and I asked that question, "How's your food?" And I don't wanna hear, "It's pretty good." I said, "Do you have a lot of regulars? Do you have a lot of repeat customers? 'Cause the food's gonna keep people coming in." Okay, another quick story. Um, I was, and you can find the actual episode is on my other YouTube channel, which is just youtube.com/Lloyd Auerbach. A lot of my media clips are there from past shows. So I was on the Joan Rivers show in 1989. In fact, I had just flown into New York um, when the earthquake hit the Bay Area, so I missed it, as it happens. The next day, I did the Joan Rivers show in New York City. The topic was friendly ghosts. Um, Joan had a friend of hers who had a friendly ghost, and there were a couple other people with friendly ghosts. One of my colleagues, Micheline Mayer, was there as well, and I was on. And as we're finishing up, one of the producers says, "I have a story you find pretty interesting." One of my friends in LA, he said, was out driving his car in one of the canyons. Or I think it was Laurel Canyon. It was basically one of the higher roads was in near one of the canyons, and you have to be careful you didn't run off the road because you'd go down an embankment, the whole thing. Well, something happened. Car, he was in his car with his dog, his German Shepherd. Something happened with the car, and the car locked up, and he ended up going over the embankment. It rolled a whole bunch of times, and he was trapped. It flipped over, so it was hanging. He was hanging down. He couldn't get out. He was trapped. It was during the daytime, at least, so we had the traffic coming through, but there was nobody was behind him. He's what the producer said, who saw him go over the embankment. So, if you've grown up with Lassie as a TV show, and if you have dogs, you probably would say to your dog, "Boy, go get help. Lassie, go get help." He and what this guy's friend said was he said to the dog, "Go get help." So, a few minutes later, at first he starts hearing the dog barking up the embankment, up on the road. A few minutes later, there are people coming down to help him get out of the car, and they have to push the car, so a bunch of people after pushing, kinda like a leverage, to pull him out, to be able to cut the seatbelt. And as they're doing that, they see a dog, a German that had been crushed to death under part of the car. And everybody's a little flabbergasted because they all saw the people who came down saw a German Shepherd standing in the middle of the road, barking at cars coming, at somebody to stop, and then led them down to the car. So we do have stories of our pets on occasion showing up after death, and in cases like this, making sure that we're okay, because they would have done that in life as well. So let's see here. Kathy, just switching back, Kathy, Joan Rivers saw a ghost and ran out of the Georgetown Music Hall. Yeah, she was, if you watch that show, she still seemed a little creeped out by the whole thing, but she was very happy to talk about friendly ghosts at that point. It's really interesting over the years that I've done so much media, uh, and frankly, I think a lot of times they talk more to me than to other people they have on some of these shows because at some point in the initial conversations, I do name drop. I name drop my dad's name, and my uncle. My uncle Larry Auerbach was a TV soap director for CBS and ABC. Um, so most people in production had heard of my dad. I don't know about anymore because they're a lot younger people now. And so I kind of get this openness because I grew up in the TV industry. And they'll tell me about their experiences or about things going on. And what's also happened is how often we've been doing segments at haunted places and things happen in the places. Uh, Even though I have yet to get any of the TV people, the producers, directors, cameramen, to go on camera and talk about what they experienced while we were doing the shoot, other than a TV pilot that I shot years ago with some friends. And almost had it happen. Did a major TV pilot for Fox, which never unfortunately aired. But one of the things we did was we made sure everyone on the crew signed a release form that they were willing to go on camera. And in fact, that happened. It's just that the pilot never went anywhere through that. So we get I get those kinds of experiences, and it's unfortunate. In fact, on Queen Mary, going back to Queen Mary, I was down there for a show, not a show. It was actually a production company that was doing some extras for the European release of the movie Ghost Ship, not the American release DVD. It's for their DVD. And there was a psychic named Michael Corey who I knew was there as well, who had a lot of experiences. Michael is kind of watching my interview, and I'm sitting. We're upstairs, up in the top of the ship, um, in the right next to the bar, one of the bars. And as we're talking, they were asking, the director is asking, so anything weird happen over the years when you've been, being interviewed? And I say, yeah, very often there's really weird electronic interference. And Michael had already given signs to me that there was somebody present. He had already sensed a spirit there. And as I'm saying this about the weird interference and stuff, the sound guy says, "There's something going on with the sound," and the camera guy goes, "There's some weird electronic interference happening right now." And we stopped, listened, watched it. It really was a really weird interference that was going on. And I said to the director, knowing the answer, "I think you need to interview the camera guy and the sound guy. I mean, or even just let's talk about this, that this just happened. I can say that. It just happened." He said, "No, no, we're the crew. People will think we made it up," which seems to be the general idea, the general feeling of a lot of these folks. Kind of crazy, if you ask me. I mean, missed opportunities. A lot of missed opportunities, actually, unfortunately. Okay. Um, how about another? All right, let's see. Another piece here. Uh, so let me talk a little bit about an unusual case that I had many years ago. It's in, if you have my book, A Paranormal Casebook, you probably have read this. I've talked about it, not on so much on this show, but I've talked about it in other places as well. It's a case that is in my Paranormal Casebook as The Sexorcist. That's a title that was given a story by a friend of mine who was writing for Playgirl magazine. In fact, that's the first place where the story actually appeared. So I was working at the American Society for Psychical Research again in the early '80s, back in New York. I lived in Westchester County, and if potential case calls had come in from Westchester, then I would be the scout. I check it out before turning it back over to Dr. Carla Sosis, who was our research director, and Alex Tanis, the psychic, and Donna McCormick, who was the research associate who was there. So I wouldn't be the main investigator at that point. I was really new to parapsychology, although I'd done some investigations. So, we get this call in. I took the call. Very often they came in funneled to the education department, which is where I was working. And I took this call. And it was a couple, and they were on extensions. And the guy's telling me that they moved into this house about just under 6 months earlier. The home itself had been built no more than 6 years before. It was in a development itself that was only about 6 years old, in the woods in northern Westchester County. And ever since they moved in, they're being bothered by some weird sounds upstairs, outside their bedroom, pretty much every night, usually around 2 to 3, or usually around 3 o'clock in the morning, somewhere around there. And I said, "So what kind of tell me about the sounds. What kind of sounds?" He said, "Well, we have 2 master suites upstairs, a really nice house, 2 master suites, and we're in one of them, and there's one just on share a wall to the other one. And it sounds like people coming from that room." And the wife is not saying anything. I said, "What kind of sounds?" And he said, "It's 2 people. They're making sounds." "What kind of sounds?" "It's 2 people. I don't know how to describe. They're 2 people." And his wife pipes up and says, "2 sounds of 2 people Making love, Howard. She didn't sound very happy. I said, "What?" She said, "Yeah, moans and groans, and we hear, like, bed squeaking. I guess there's 2 people, you know, making love in the next room." Okay. That was interesting. Um, and this is happening every night. He says, "It's really weird. First of all, if it started happening every night, we noticed that it wasn't happening Sunday nights to Monday morning, but every other night around 3 o'clock in the morning. Not exactly the same time, but pretty close to the same time every time." Then we go out and check out where the sound go in that room. And he said, "Yeah, it was waking us up." So we learned how to turn it off. We got up out of bed, usually it's me, 'cause my wife makes and she made a noise that and he walk out in the hallway. He could still hear the sounds from the hallway. As soon as you cross the threshold of the other bedroom, the sound stopped and they were off for the rest of the night. So I did go up there, made arrangements to go up there on a late Friday afternoon. I also wanted to see if we could find out about the previous owners from the neighbors, just generally at that point. And normally, I've taught since the mid '80s to never go alone. I felt pretty okay about it because I knew the neighborhood. They described the neighborhood. I knew where it was. I wasn't too worried about this being a crazy people in that sense. And um, so I get to the house. I start talking to them about it. They take me through the house. They certainly know apparent reason why this could be happening. And I had already checked at the historical society whether there could be sort of weird activity. I didn't even know what activity I was looking for because normally in that part of the world, you'd get Revolutionary War military activity or Native American activity. So I had no idea what was going on. Again, 6-year-old house. Found out nothing about that. So we're talking, and I said, "Have you talked to the neighbors about the previous owners? Have you found out this was something that they were experiencing at all?" He said, "No, we've gotten to know a couple of the neighbors. Are you okay talking to them about this or saying the house is haunted?" And he said, "Yeah, we can talk." So some of them are home right now, so we went to a couple of houses, knocked on the door, and eventually there was a guy next door who had just come home from work. He was friends with the previous owners, and we just said the house was haunted. Didn't really say what it was. It wasn't scary. Didn't talk about that. I explained who I was, and I said, "Was there anything unusual, like behavior-wise, about the previous owners?" He said, "No, they're a couple of really nice kids. They moved in right after the house was built." He says, "I'm one of the first people who moved in. They moved in right after me. They were in their early 20s. They're both like fledgling stockbrokers, which is what they do now. In fact, they don't live here anymore because they didn't want to commute anymore, and they moved into Manhattan, sold the house." He said, "Nice kids." I said, "Any big parties, anything?" He said, "No, no, but, we had small parties, but dinner parties and things like that, but nothing like that." I said, "Was there anything unusual about anything around that house?" And he said, "Well, the only thing I can tell you is that" yeah, they had just gotten married, and they were pretty young. And in the spring and the fall, when you had your windows open, every once in a while, because of the way the houses are situated with each other, my wife and I would get woken up in the middle of the night to the sounds of the 2 of them going at it really loud, like wildcats from that window over there, and he's pointing to the window of that other master bedroom. So, apparently, a really good impression was left behind by the past owners. He then gives me the phone number for the guy who used to own the house, and I left it with the family that here's a few things that Alex Tannis, our psychic, has suggested you could do. But I'm gonna check with the previous owner, just kind of confirm some things anyway, but here's what you can do. Number 1, you can ignore it. It seems to be I explained what a residual haunting was. I explained that it was just memory, place memory, just like living next to a really busy highway. You eventually get, once you know what the sound is, you get used to it, you don't even hear it anymore. He he looked at me and he said, "Could you get used to that?" I haven't heard it, so I'm not quite sure. The other thing you can do is you can record over it more or less. One of the ways to do that Alex suggested was to have a party. I mean, not a huge party, but have a party, but make sure you have fun, get some laughter going and other stuff in that other room as well as your own bedroom, throughout the house. Positive vibes. And the wife says, "Does this mean we'll hear the sounds of a party waking us up every night?" I said, "Okay, good point. Well, you could always go in that room yourself and leave a different impression behind." And the guy says, "We'll get back to you." Monday morning, I call over to the previous owner, get him on the phone, explained who I was. He's very puzzled. "Why are you calling?" I said, "Well, I'm calling because of the house that you sold to these people. Um, seems to be something like I can't say it's a ghost, but kind of there's some activity there, some haunting activity." It's like, "What are you talking about?" And he starts getting very defensive, thinking that they want to cancel the deal, even though they've been living there for almost 6 months. I said, hold on a minute. Let me just simply ask you a very easy question. Does 3 o'clock in the morning mean anything to you and your wife?" And there's silence. And he says, "Okay, what's going on?" And I told him, and he said, "Well, it's a long story. I'm not going to explain why, but yes, we still do. We were getting up around 3 o'clock in the morning and making love." So what about Sunday night to Monday morning? He said, "Well, we had to sleep sometime." So I called back the current owners, get them on the phone, and I say, here's what happened. Yes, they left an impression behind. It's just a recording. They were in that room, all of that. And what have you decided to do? And you need me to bring up a, a psychic to maybe do a cleansing or anything. And his wife said, "No, that's okay. We moved our bed into that bedroom. So now any noises that are going to be left by us." I really pity the next family that moves into that house. Okay, back to questions. Let's see. First, I have not seen K-pop Demon Hunters. I plan on watching it. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about. Audio seems to be gone. Oh, it was on your end. Okay. Forever Family Foundation was on the telepathy tapes. Yeah, the Forever Family Foundation was also on a show which is on Netflix called Surviving Death. If you, I think it's episode 4 of Surviving Death. That show is based on Leslie Kane's book, Kean, called Surviving Death. And in fact, I have a chapter I contributed about one of my best cases of apparitions, and I'm in episode 5, along with I work with named Mariah Canal. So pretty cool stuff there. Let's see here. Um, I'll just mention the Forever Family Foundations. We had this grief retreat here in Milpitas. There's one that's going to be in Florida. There'll be another couple that'll be in Connecticut in the spring and summer. And we are now talking about, not confirmed yet, because we have to have a board meeting about it, but we're talking about, rather than doing a grief retreat next year somewhere in California, we're talking about doing an actual convention, like a conference on the afternoon with different aspects and mediums and such. So be open to anybody. We probably have a grief track also, but it'll be open to anybody who wants to come and learn or see mediums or see other folks as well. There'll be more coming on this podcast as we figure out what's going on. Not sure if we can do it in Northern California. We'll be doing it in Southern California. We've wanted to do a conference again for a few years, but I'm hoping we can kind of pull that off real soon. And if you go to foreverfamilyfoundation.org, you'll see information about the organization. You'll see our list of mediums tab. You'll see a list of certified tested mediums, including Kathy Nadal, who is with us uh, today, and a number of other mediums as well. Okay, summary call. It was a call that was next door when you stayed at the Beverly Hilton. Footsteps were right up the wall. There are a lot of really weird impressions and imprints about it. Sometimes it has to do with the structure, before maybe it was renovated. There is a building in Village. It's 12 Gay Street. That's the name of the street. That's what it's always been. It was originally a single house. It was at one point cut in half and cut again. So there's like 4 apartments in there. And back in the early 1960s, one of the folks living, or some of the folks living in one of the apartments, reported seeing a figure coming out of the shadows on a regular basis in like a tux, evening clothes. But that was what he ended up looking like. It looked like a shadowy figure with a cloak that morphed into that. And then there was a description of the facial features, which were unique about this individual. And Hans Holzer investigated the place, wrote it up in his books. But at the same time, some reporter figured out that one of the past residents in that particular apartment was a very unique individual. And Holzer never got that. But before I get to him, Holzer found that the other things being reported in downstairs was sounds of people running up and down non-existent stairs. There were stairs elsewhere, but not where against the wall. Well, it turned out when they cut the house in half, they got rid of a staircase, they had to build 2 others. They got rid of the central staircase, and there had been kids in the house. They'd had parties in the house, and then that had left an impression behind. So, even though the staircase is non-existent, the impression is still as if the staircase was there. That individual who I mentioned a moment ago, which was after Walter published, started talking about his experience with the medium there, was a man named Walter B. Gibson. And I love talking about Gibson, especially since I got to meet him, partly 'cause he's one of my literary heroes as well. You may not know him, but Walter Gibson was a magician, wrote numerous books about magic. He wrote the book on the rules of poker, and he also was the ghostwriter for Houdini and Thurston and a whole bunch of others as well. But more importantly for me is 2 things. Number 1, Walter Gibson is the creator of the shadow, as in Who Knows What Evil Lurks in the Hearts of Men, wrote 285 novels of the shadow. I have many of them in reprints, and I'm a big fan of them. The other is that when I was working at the ASPR, I ran across some of our files from the 1950s. He did investigations of apparitions, hauntings, poltergeists. In fact, he was involved somewhat in the very famous Seaford copper poltergeist case that happened in 1958 on Long Island. And so Gibson was interviewed because he used to live there, and he said he was shocked to hear the description of the figure because the facial features and even the initial impression matched the shadow, and Lamont Cranston, the other identity of the shadow, or one of the other identities of the shadow. And Gibson said, it's very possible. And Gibson, by the way, was very much uh, into psychic phenomena and especially ESP and things like that. Not so much ghosts, but other stuff. And wrote a couple of books on the occult and about on parapsychology as well. He said, maybe because I wrote the way I wrote, and I wrote the last group of shadow novels in that apartment, pretty much near where this figure was seen. The way he wrote was to imagine the character, the shadow, narrating the story to him. So putting a lot of mental energy into that character. He said, "Maybe I left a thought form behind, not so much intelligent or conscious, but he thinks he left the shadow." So he felt that that was truly a shadow person, different kind of shadow person as well. All right, Paranormal Casebook 2, actually have right in front of me, I have the list of stories that are gonna go into it. I have started writing it. I had some issues that came up health-wise for me, and some other issues in our house as we had some renovation going on that prevented me from catching up on things. So I'm about 6 months behind my writing projects. But you'll be happy to know, for those of you who have read any of the Rainy and Day novels, the paranormal mystery novels I co-authored with Rich Hozek and Arnold Rudnick. We've done 2. One is called Near Death, the other is called Afterlife, and we have a third one that is in process finally after a couple of years. Rich is working on the first draft, and then we'll get this out hopefully in the next few months. It'll be called Farsight. It involves remote viewing this time. So, Rainy and Day is kind of our version, not the X-Files certainly, but there's a lot of real parapsychology in the books as well. Um, the telepathy, Paul's mentioning telepathy tapes, and I'm going to tell you one more quick ghost story here. And of course, next time I can do the same. I can tell you stories if we have a lull. But telepathy tapes, if you go to paranormaldailynews.com, that is a news site. I'm one of the editors there. We're actually Paranormal Daily News is going to be publishing an academic journal and a magazine called Paranormal. And there's an article by Craig Weiler from a few months ago that looks at the telepathy tapes, especially talking about Diane Powell's work on autistic kids. And he talked to her because the telepathy tapes doesn't tell the true story, the full story, or even the real story. There's a lot more to it that's there. So pretty good stuff. So the last quick story. This is not my story again. This is a very unique thing that you can do. Ever want to get people to talk about their ghost stories? Here's one way to do it. I haven't had to do this, but It's in the back of my head all the time. My colleague Keith Ferrari, who was a psychologist, but he was a psychic kid. He did out of body stuff. In fact, he was a research subject in many research studies on out of body experience. Um, in those studies, his nickname is Blue Harari. He later on started doing remote viewing. He was involved in a lot of remote viewing work back in the 1980s, and he would occasionally hear about cases, ghost cases, things like that. So there was a hospital here in Northern California, in the Bay Area. Keith was called by one of the nurses there, saying that at the terminal ward there was, and this is not an uncommon thing, by the way. People were the staff was experiencing all these figures that were kind of like definitely not physically there. Ghosts. They were seeing some leftover emotion. There's a lot there, but they were seeing some what seemed to be interactive. And Keith wanted. He was asking questions. Able to talk to a couple of the other nurses. He said he really wanted to talk to everybody who might have had an experience. And she said the doctors will they just call. He said, "Okay, I want you to call a staff meeting and tell them you're going to meet with with me. You can call me a psychologist, whatever you want. Um, just or tell me when there's a staff meeting and have me as a guest. And but I want you to tell them if you're going to tell them we're going to talk about the activity because they're going to show up, but they're not going to say anything. Tell them to each bring a bag of marshmallows. Right? That's the instruction. Come to the meeting. Just he's a psychologist. He can talk about parapsychology or whatever else. Bring a bag of marshmallows. So they all get in the room, and the doctors are there, and that are not on duty, and there's the other staff that's there. And the one nurse starts talking about her experience, and then a couple of the other nurses start talking about theirs, and Keith is asking questions. And one of the doctors says, "What is a bag of marshmallows for?" In other words, it turned out they all came because of the instruction to bring a bag of marshmallows. And Keith said, "Eat them." And then he started asking them questions about their experiences, and they all started laughing and opening up. They also don't open up the bag of marshmallows. So apparently, if you ask people who don't want to talk about things to bring something unusual, they will show up out of curiosity, even if it's something they don't want to talk about. And we're almost out of time now. So, um, okay, just seeing summer so Susanna called by a what? What is that reference to there? Oh, okay. Disregard. All right. Well, I just want to say I'm sorry about the initial problems with getting online, getting connected. I'm not sure what happened with YouTube. At least now I know if this happens again. If if my producer, who is not available today, to take a sudden trip for some work thing, he's unavailable, and I start doing it live on YouTube myself. At least I know then if I open another window and just simply start it up again, it'll work fine because it connected right away. I want to just thank you all for always attending. Just a reminder to please subscribe. Just tell your friends. Trying to get more and more people to jump in. Feel free to send any questions you have to me. You can find my email address in the description for the channel. You'll find links to the Rhine Research Center, to the Rhine Education Center, the Forever Family Foundation. Go to my website, LloydAuerbach.com. Just remember to spell Lloyd with one L, and you will see a resources page with all sorts of resources in parapsychology, online resources, a lot of free information that's out there, kind of countering the reality TV stuff that's there on all aspects of parapsychology that's available. And there's plenty of other stuff there as well as links to other podcasts. And Paul, I know you're going to ask. I did just put up 2 new podcast links on my media page on my website. There'll be a couple more coming as well. So I also want to wish you all a very happy Halloween. I hope you all get spooky this time of year. I know that we probably will. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks. So November 9th is the next session, and I hope you do join us. Bring your friends. Hopefully, we won't have weird spooky sound effects unless I make them intentional. All right. Good night, everybody.